to be me talking at you with slides like for the entire day. I kind of try to break it up. We've got just a little bit of lecture and slides, some conversations. And then in the afternoon, I've got 2 hands-on labs, one that we'll walk through all together, and then one that's a bit of a CTF competition with a scoreboard, and you earn points for finding vulnerabilities or hacking. We usually let that run for like an hour or 2, and the winner will get some kudos and a little prize from OWASP. So I'll open up my slides, but actually before I do that, I think this is the latest that I've done one of these trainings in terms of like your code platoon schedule. So I'm just curious, like, where are you all at? Like, what's been some of the latest stuff that you've been learning in the last week or 2?
It's like they've been learning React, as well as combining React and Django for the back end, and a little bit of authentication, authorization.
Oh, perfect.
Yep.
Cool. Then yeah, that'll work really nicely. We're definitely going to be talking a lot about JavaScript today. A little bit of React. I think some of the examples are applicable to Python as well if you're used to Django, but very language agnostic, right? Security is pretty language agnostic. I'm not here to tell you one language is more secure than the other. So, all right, let me jump in then to the intro slides, and we'll go from there. So, by the way, I love it when this is just very kind of relaxed and conversational. So feel free to just jump in with questions or comments. The way my screen's set up is like right now when I'm sharing, I can't really see the Zoom chat. I don't think it like alerts me. So if you have a question, either unmute yourself and just ask it, or if someone sees a question that gets posted in the Zoom chat, if you don't mind just pausing me, and I'll make sure to open up the Zoom chat and read the question. Otherwise, I'm assuming everyone can see my slides here.
Yep.
If not, tell me, I'll make them full screen and we'll jump right into it.
You can see them.
Cool. Oh, actually, before I even do that, my name's down here. Like I said, my name is Ronnie Flathers. I go by Ropnop. I'm on Twitter. So you can follow me or find me on Twitter. You can also find me on LinkedIn. And this is my personal email address. If at the end of this or throughout this, you have any follow-up questions or you want to just stay in touch, find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or feel free to just shoot me an email. Happy to respond or answer anything that maybe we don't get to today. So like I said, high-level agenda, a little bit of intro about me, about OWASP, which is the organization that I'm here on behalf of right today. Then we're going to talk just high-level security concepts. We won't even get super technical right to begin with. It's just going to be some overarching discussions around concepts of cybersecurity, how to have these conversations, what security means when you're working as a developer or as an engineer. Then we're going to go back to the basics. I kind of like to assume with these classes, like, let's just go all the way back and learn the basics of web applications, how they work, how HTTP works, because it's really important to build upon that foundation. If you want to understand security and security vulnerabilities, we have to have a good in-depth understanding of like how web technologies even work to begin with. So for some of you, this might be like the section that you kind of zone out because we're going really basic. But I think it's really important to go back and make sure we're all on the same page on what these technologies are, how they work together, and then how they build modern web applications. Then we'll actually dive into the vulnerabilities. So I'll do some deep dives on some common classes of web vulnerabilities. The main ones we're going to be focusing on are cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, injection attacks, and then time permitting, I actually don't think we got to this one last time, but just depending on where we are, I can also talk about cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS, which in and of itself is not a vulnerability, it's actually a feature, but they're so commonly misconfigured that it leads to vulnerabilities. Then we'll jump in to the hands-on lab exercises. I posted a link in the Zoom chat. If you all don't mind, please download and try to install Burp Suite Community Edition. It's a free piece of software that we use to do web security testing. And that's what I'm going to be walking through live, and I'd like you to follow along. And we'll also potentially be using it for the CTF. In terms of times, like I said, we'll probably do all the slides and agenda, or the slides and discussions between now and like lunchtime. And then I'll take a lunch break, and when we get back, we'll switch gears and we'll do the setting up Burp Suite, do the hands-on lab, and then we'll end the day with like an hour or two long just competition CTF. Sound good? Cool. So brief introduction on me. I know Tom already mentioned it. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois. For those of you who were on at the beginning, I actually mentioned I just moved. I've lived in downtown Chicago for like the last 8 years. My wife and I just moved out to the suburbs, so I'm in my brand new house. We just got settled here last week. But I have worked in security in one form or another pretty much my entire career. I started off as just an actual junior penetration tester and a red teamer, and was working consulting for a long time with a company called NeoHapsis that was eventually acquired by Cisco. And while there, it was consulting, it was pen testing, which I'll talk a little bit more about the concept of pen testing, but we were basically paid to break into companies' networks or break companies' applications, emulate attackers and hackers, find the vulnerabilities, and then write reports and show them how it was done. So I did consulting for a long time, focused on Windows and Active Directory security, did web application security, mobile app security, all different types of security and penetration testing. And then switched gears and really started to focus specifically on application security and web application security. So after I left consulting, I joined a company called Uptake, which was a tech startup here in Chicago, and helped build their application security program. That's when I really started to work more closely with developers and engineers. It wasn't just about being a hacker and finding vulns. It was about finding vulnerabilities at scale and then working with engineers on how to fix them at scale as well. And I really, really enjoy that challenge, and that's still what I do today. Bounced from Uptake to Motorola Solutions, where I also was helping build and lead their application security program. And for the last 6 months, I've joined a company. They're actually based in the Bay Area, but I work remotely here from Chicago, called Marquetta, where I'm a principal security engineer for our product security team. So this is my contact information. Like I said, Twitter, GitHub, actually some of the labs and tools I've open sourced and they're on my GitHub. And I blog occasionally, it could be a good reference, but just throwing it out there at blog.ropnop.com as well. Now the introduction about OWASP. Quick show of hands, I guess I can see some of the videos here, or shout it out, like who's heard of OWASP before or has any interaction with OWASP? Anyone? Nope. Well, then I'm super happy to introduce this to you because I think OWASP is awesome. So I'm a member of OWASP. I've been involved in OWASP for many years. OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project, and we are a nonprofit foundation with different self-governing chapters around the world. I'm involved in the Chicago chapter, and it's really just a foundation of security professionals and software engineers and developers who have come together to try to just share information and raise awareness around web application security. And so OWASP has a ton of free resources, tools, and trainings. We publish a lot of things. We have conferences and chapters and meetups, and it's really just about trying to raise awareness for whether you're a developer, an architect, a software engineer, a risk analysis, or even just someone with an interest in security. We try to really just raise awareness of security. So the whole reason I got actually hooked up with Code Platoon is because I think it was Tom or perhaps someone else had just reached out to the Chicago chapter of OWASP, and the president of the Chicago chapter of OWASP was actually my previous employer, my previous boss at my last employer. Said, hey, this organization, Code Platoon, proactively reached out. They're interested in learning a bit more about security. And I jumped at the opportunity and said, yes, this is exactly what OWASP is for. I've got slides. I can put trainings together. Let's teach security to up and coming developers. And that's awesome. It's just really big kudos to Code Platoon for being proactive and reaching out, because that's something that we always strive for. We need to teach security and get these concepts embedded in people learning to be software engineers or learning to be developers, because that's oftentimes just missing from a lot of the courses and curriculum. I don't know if any of you went to school for software engineering or computer science, but like when I did, there was zero mention ever of any security concepts at all. Like I had to learn all of this post-college. So I'm happy that we're introducing this now and teaching it. So some of the tools and trainings and resources from OWASP, perhaps most famously, OWASP publishes the OWASP Top 10. This is a curated list of the top 10 most critical web application security risks. And this comes out every 4 years. It's based on a bunch of industry data and feedback from colleagues and peers within the industry. And it's a really good kind of summation of what the industry is seeing as the top 10 most critical risks to web application security. We also publish the OWASP Application Security Verification Standards, or ASVS, which you can kind of think of as a detailed checklist of security requirements. If you are building a web application, you can follow the ASVS requirements and basically just check off that you're doing all the security things you need to. And a lot of them may not apply because it's very agnostic to technology, but it's a great framework and reference guide to use as you're building or architecting a web app. The software assurance maturity model is for more executives who are building an application security program, but it also gives you a checklist, a framework, and guidance on how to build a security program within an organization. And then lastly, the Z-Attack Proxy is an open source tool that's really useful to do manual penetration testing of web apps or automated scanning of web apps. OWASP sponsors several conferences. Unfortunately, I don't think there's been one now for over a year because of COVID, but there are global conferences where there's trainings and speakers. Last one was in DC. And then there's local chapters. So here I put the link to anyone who's interested in the Chicago chapter. We haven't met in person in over a year, but it's we do Zoom conferences every other month or so. Great way to network or meet people. If you're not in Chicago, look it up on the OWASP.org site. I'm sure there's a chapter in one of your main metro areas that you can also get in touch with. Cool. So now we're going to kind of dive into just some high-level security topics. I'd be curious to hear, I'm actually always curious to hear from everyone on the call, what's been your experience or exposure to security? I'm not sure how many of you are currently employed as developers or engineers, or if you've been in a company and had to interact or work with your information security team or your security department, or has anyone just played around and tried to learn hacking or bug bounties or anything like that? Anyone want to just speak up and give me a quick update on have you done anything with security, either professionally or personally?
I messed around with Hack the Box a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, Hack the Box is great if y'all aren't familiar with that. Free platform online. Well, free, I think you can also pay for a license, but little challenges to hack the box essentially. Really great way to learn. I learned doing very similar. Hack the Box wasn't around then, but just kind of boot to root, they called it.
I did 4 years of IDS deployment.
Cool. Like open source IDSs, or we're using commercial software, commercial IDSs?
Snort plus some homegrown stuff. I was working for AFOSI.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so intrusion detection systems, for those not familiar, or on the network security side, but sniffing packets and identifying signatures, malicious activity on the network. It's really cool. Anyone else? Anyone ever get in trouble from their security department? Get a message for clicking on a bad link or installing something not approved?
Yep. Emailing something out to an email address that should not go outside of the current company's network or something.
Busted. Yep. Yeah, I always love hearing those stories because I'm on that security team, right? I never like to get people in trouble. It's never our intention at all. But yeah, we do get the alerts of something being installed or someone using something that's not approved, or clicking on some bad links or going to some bad websites. I'll leave it at that.
In the Navy, we had a few people get in trouble for plugging their iPhones into the work computers to charge them.
Interesting. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me if for the Navy, right? A lot of organizations are really locked down. You shouldn't be bringing in any external devices, plugging in anything, right? the risk I'm sure that they're worried about is that your iPhone's infected or carrying a payload, and you plug it into a secure system and it transfers right in there.
Yeah, I was on the team that went and picked up those computers when people would plug in their devices, and it was a good time whenever that would happen.
Did you do forensic investigations of them or try to figure out
No,
what happened?
that got passed off to our like dedicated IA folks. I was just like a local unit information assurance guy, so really just basic Active Directory stuff. But we were responsible for picking them up and giving them off.
Oh, okay, cool. Cool. Well, it sounds like you all at least have some, if not firsthand, third-hand experience with security. So what I'm going to talk about in this section is sort of like some of the lingo or the terms of the trade when it comes to security, because I think it's really important to have that vernacular down and that vocabulary down so we can talk and think like security people and get on their same page. So to begin with, this is one of my favorite quotes. It's from a gentleman named Jim Manico, who for many years was on the board of OWASP. He's just a very influential man in application security. He's done a lot of work for OWASP. He runs his own company and does security training. And his quote is, "From my experience, all software developers are now security engineers, whether they know it, admit to it, or do it. Your code is now the security of the org you work for." Hashtag golden age of defense. And this resonates so much with me because it's been exactly my experience working and building security programs. In the past, security was siloed very much from the rest of engineering. You had your dedicated InfoSec team or your information assurance team, and you had your developers, and they like never really interacted. And it was like security is just the security department's job, and engineering is just the engineering department's job. And that just doesn't fly anymore. That's definitely not the case. Security is no longer a specialized silo. It is everyone's job. And the first line of defense for modern day security of web applications are the developers who are building the web applications themselves. Me as a security person, if I want to make the biggest impact, it's not going to come from me. It's going to come from you. It's going to come from whoever's actually building the web applications. If we can teach the concepts of security and have you become secure developers, that's going to have a way bigger impact than anything I can do by myself with any tools or scanners or anything like that. I'm sure you've heard the term DevOps, and we've been shifting, the industry has been shifting left and shifting towards this concept of DevOps, but that brings on this other concept of total ownership of code. If you're working in a DevOps organization, you're doing development and ops, right? DevOps, but it really means you own your code end to end. And that means you also own the security of your code as well. And that's also then shifted what my teams, the team that I'm on, the application security team, like we're no longer becoming the gatekeepers in our ivory tower looking at code and saying like pass, fail, or that can go to prod or that cannot go to prod. Like that's no longer really the responsibility of a security team in my mind. We're becoming more enablers. A lot of what I do in my day job nowadays is just sitting around thinking and building things to make developers' lives easier. I need to make security as easy as possible for developers, and that includes education, tooling, platforms, etc. But I'm not trying to just go find vulnerabilities and then rub people's noses in it and get them in trouble. I'm trying to enable developers like you all to become better and more secure engineers. And going back to why I think it's just so great that Code Platoon is doing this, because to be a successful developer in today's age, you will have to know security concepts. And if you're coming out of Code Platoon and coming out of today's session and looking for a job as a software engineer or developer, or just trying to move up the ladder in your current role at your current organization, you will have a step up over a lot of other people who are coming who don't have any security knowledge whatsoever. So this comes back to what I mentioned earlier, sort of the language of security. On the left here, this is a really common term or phrase within security. It's called the CIA triad. And it stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And almost every security vulnerability or security thing that we do boils down to trying to protect one of these three. So when you look at your data or your systems, you always need to think about is it the confidentiality of that data, the integrity of that data, and the availability of that data. And confidentiality, of course, means only people who are authorized to see it should be able to see it. The integrity means that the data has not been tampered with, that we can trust the data. And the availability, of course, means that when we want to see the data, we can see the data. It's actually available. And unfortunately, in security, there's always trade-offs between these three. You can't have a 100% secure, perfect system where all three of these are 100% secure or 100%, confidential, integrity, or available. Oftentimes, we need to sacrifice one, or we need to like rank them a little bit on which one is potentially more important. And depending on what application you're designing and how you're coding, you need to think about, what is the most important. Sometimes confidentiality is the most critical thing of these three. Like you can sacrifice a little availability, but you cannot let anyone else see the data unless they're authorized. I worked at Motorola Solutions in the past. We built radio systems and communication platforms for first responders, and our credence there was availability was actually the most important thing. I mean, we needed to have availability because if you tried to call 911 in an emergency and you couldn't reach our systems, that's a big problem. And so everything we did was guided by availability first and foremost. And unfortunately, that meant sometimes like we had to sacrifice confidentiality or integrity. I shouldn't say sacrifice. Of course, that was very important to us as well. But every decision that we made was always guided by availability first and foremost. And that may not be the case in some organizations or systems where you may just say confidentiality first and foremost. Or if you're in a financial system where every cent and dollar needs to be accounted for, integrity could be your first and foremost. On the right here is just the relationships between a lot of the terms that we use. The main ones that I'm going to be talking about today that I think it's important to understand are the bottom here, which are controls, vulnerabilities, threats, and risks. So whenever we say the term control, we really just mean we've put something into place to lower and reduce our risk. And that could be something like a patch. We could fix our code, and that would be a control. We could just put some additional logging in place, and that could be a control. Any action that we take to address a security risk is a control. The other terms to just be familiar with and know about are threats and vulnerabilities, which unfortunately sometimes get used interchangeably, but I'd like to stress here, and we'll talk a bit more about it, like how they're actually different. Threats are ever present. Threats exist no matter what. You can stay awake at night and you can think of all the threats to something and they're just always there. Vulnerabilities may or may not be there. Vulnerabilities are something that are introduced, whether through negligence, whether through ignorance, whether just by pure happenstance or accident. Like vulnerabilities get introduced to a system, and then those threats that are ever present exploit them. And when a threat exploits a vulnerability, it increases risk. So just think about the difference there between threats and vulnerabilities. We'll never be able to eliminate threats. Threats are like the boogeyman. They could be, threats are just always there. We can think of a bunch of threats, but we can control vulnerabilities and we can control controls of it. And between, having control over vulnerabilities and controls, we can mitigate risk, even if we can't necessarily remove threats. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. So let's take that concept one step further here, threats versus vulnerabilities, what I just described. As we are software engineers and developers, it's always important to think like an attacker. So we have to put our kind of red hats on or our black hats on and think like attackers. But we also have to contextualize everything and be realistic. It's very easy when you're talking about security to become like Chicken Little and scream that the sky is falling and work yourself up into a tizzy every night because the world is a scary place and there's a billion threats and a million things can go wrong and there's no sense in even trying to defend against it because what's the point, right? Get an existential crisis. But we have to think about it and be realistic in the terms of the system or the application that we are defining. So it's necessary to understand both threats and vulnerabilities, and we do that through threat modeling and vulnerability scanning. And when you combine threats and vulnerabilities, then we can actually understand the risk to our platform. So I'd like to do a little exercise here. Let's not get technical. Let's not think about web applications or cloud infrastructure or network systems. Let's just take it back to like the real analog world and imagine that we are building a bank, like an old-fashioned bank in a Wild West town or something. And we are in charge of architecting and designing and engineering this bank. Well, the first thing that we'd want to do is threat model, and that's just coming up with what are the threats to a bank. And remember what I said, right? Threats are just always present. There's always something we need to think about. So let me throw it to you, like just unmute and throw out some answers. Like, what do you think would be threats to a bank that we would need to think about if we're building a bank?
A physical robbery.
Yeah, perfect. That's probably first and foremost when you're building a bank, is like there's always the threat of strong-armed robbery.
There would be the threat of
Hacking into online accounts.
Say that again, sorry.
Hackers hacking into online accounts.
Okay, yeah, definitely. So there's the physical threat of like bank robbers with guns, and then there's certainly like the online threat of cyber hackers or cyber risk, right, of hacking into our online portal.
Internal
there's
threats.
also
Yep, I heard someone say internal threats. Sorry, I know people are talking over each other. Expand on that though. What do you mean by internal threats?
Employee theft. Things like
Yep.
that.
Definitely got to think about that. So yeah, absolutely internal, like employee theft. Malicious insiders, they're called. Someone who's working for the bank that could embezzle or steal.
risk to your property due to like environmental, say like a fire happens and your sprinkler system goes off, which shorts out your entire security system.
Great. Yeah, I'm super happy you mentioned that, because it's not necessarily just about people acting, people trying to steal. There's environmental threats. There's absolutely acts of God. There's fires, there's floods, there's tornadoes. These are threats to our business and threats to our bank as well.
Fake checks.
Yep. Yeah, so fraud or fake checks for sure are threats. We could lose money. We could give money that is fraudulent. Our books could end up being upside down if we're not careful. Those are definitely threats to the bank.
Could have
Yep, go ahead.
errors in procedures that cause a money transaction to go to a wrong account, and the bank loses money that way from the
Sure.
software.
Yep. Yeah. So the threat of money mismanagement, basically, or missing messing up our ledger, typoing an account number or something.
I don't know if this counts as a threat, but I guess you can say like money laundering or like structuring when people are depositing dirty money like structurally throughout the month without making like a huge deposit at once. I don't know if that's really like a threat, but
No. I think it's a good one. I'm not a financial expert here, but I have to imagine, like, if our bank didn't take necessary precautions to prevent money laundering, the government would shut us down, or the government could fine us or put me in jail, right? So there's definitely the threat of, untoward activity happening in my bank that I'm not aware of that could pose this existential risk to my entire company of getting our bank charter removed.
yeah, I used to work at some banks, and that's one thing we'd look out for a lot, like pay attention, like if somebody deposits something consistently on like maybe this amount on this date consistently, like every month, or deposits like 200 this week, 300 that week, you kind of just have to like pay attention and stuff sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's a good one.
Old technology.
Old technology. Okay. What do you mean? Or expand on that a little bit. Let's break that down into the actual threat here.
Like they're using older equipment, older software that has, vulnerabilities in it, and they don't realize it, and they're continuing to use that software.
Okay. So yeah, and absolutely. In that case, right, it kind of falls on the same threat of the cyber attackers or the cyber risk, right? And a hacker would exploit the old technology that has vulnerabilities, and the threat there to our company would be, our online presence can just get hacked by anyone.
Social engineering.
Yeah, that's a good one. Definitely. Actually, yeah. So going back, I know someone previously said insiders, and we talked about malicious insiders. Is there a concept of a non-malicious insider? Like, a perfectly good employee with no malicious intent, can they be a threat to us?
Yes, due to ignorance.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. Due to ignorance, negligence, just typoing an account number clicking on a link. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to have bad intent to be considered a threat or a vulnerability. Good. I love all these answers. You guys are crushing it. The next question we kind of answered already, and maybe I didn't mention it on the previous slide, but threat actors are the actual people that can carry out threats. I think we've kind of already talked about that. In the first threat that we talked about was like strong armed robbery or armed robbery of the bank. In that case, the threat actor are bank robbers. For malicious insiders, the threat actors are employees. So I think we've kind of covered the threat actors here. Now here's where it gets a little fun: is take one of those threats. Let's just take the threat of bank robbery, of armed robbery. Now remember, that threat is always present. There's always bank robbers in the world. We always need to think about bank robbers. But a vulnerability is something that we can control or accidentally introduce that can make our bank more susceptible to that threat. So what would a vulnerability be in the sense of we're designing a bank that would make our bank much more susceptible to bank robbery?
Not having security
Predictability.
cameras on the outside.
Not having security around the outside of the bank, I heard. Yeah.
Predictability of scheduling when you accept money.
Nice. I like that one. That's very specific. I can imagine you with your whiteboard of your schedule up with our bank our bank security guards and planning the robbery. Any other vulnerabilities? You know, I'm building the bank and I just overlook something or make a dumb mistake as I designed the bank and it's like way more likely to get robbed.
No alarm system?
Yeah, good one.
Keeping current with regulations.
Known
Vault.
defect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could skimp out and buy like the cheapest vault I could find, you know, from Alibaba, from China, but I realized that it doesn't actually work or have a, you know, working lock, right? Or the combinations 1, 2, 3, 4. Those would definitely be vulnerabilities. You know,
Not
let's
having
Yep.
not having like energy backup to be able to deal with power outages.
Nice. I'm glad you mentioned that actually, because I was going to say, like, let's take the other threat of the environmental threats, you know, earthquakes and fires and tornadoes. Are there any vulnerabilities that make us more susceptible to that? That's definitely one. If we don't have a power backup and we lose power because of an environmental thing, that's a vulnerability. So lastly, based on those vulnerabilities, what are the controls that we can put into place as I'm building this bank to mitigate those vulnerabilities?
Practicing procedure consistently, I guess you can say.
Yeah, good call. Yep. I think we said some of them, the way that we phrased some of the vulnerabilities were really sort of just a lack of control. So we said something like, you know, not having security cameras. That's a vulnerability. Naturally, the control for that would be have security cameras. So security cameras are a control. Armed guards are a control. Policies and procedures are a control. And those mitigate the vulnerability that makes us susceptible to the threat of bank robbery. So do you see how all those things kind of like fit together? It's almost like it's just this ongoing relationship of threats, vulnerabilities, and controls. What we essentially just did was a threat model and a vulnerability identification or a vulnerability scan of a bank. And I like to use this example because in the analog world, you know, you can think of cops and robbers in the old Wild West. Like, it's easy to think of these things, but everything we just did is exactly what you should do when you define and start building a web application. And this is what we do as security teams, is think about these, but not as a bank of like a platform of an application. We think about the threats that are always existing, and then we start thinking about the vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those threat actors. And then we think about the controls that have to be in place to address those vulnerabilities. So nothing, you know, it's nothing magic. It's nothing crazy when you want to do a threat model or you hear that term get thrown around. That's really what we just did. Just sit with a whiteboard and brainstorm and think about threats, vulnerabilities, and controls. So that's one of the types of security assessments. If you work with a mature security organization or security department within your organization, at some point or another, we will perform at least one of these activities against code bases, against applications. So the first is threat modeling. It's really what we just did. In a technical way, I do threat models with developers and architects at my current company. We just sit in a Zoom like this with a virtual whiteboard and just spitball ideas. It's really just a brainstorming session, and we come up with the threats and we architect it out, and we think about as if we're designing this, what we can do to mitigate it. Threat modeling can be kind of fun when you think of it like that. The other activities that get performed are a bit more technical, and oftentimes tools and automations do these. So static application security testing, or SAST, is actually looking and scanning at source code. So you're writing your Django applications, and you're writing your React applications. So you're writing JavaScript and you're writing Python. If you were to do static application security testing, you would actually run a code against your source code as you write it or after you've written it that can identify vulnerabilities. SAST is sort of like spell checker for code, but it's spell checker for security issues. There's engines out there that can identify known weaknesses in code, like they understand Python, they understand Django, they understand React, and can help you find vulnerabilities. It's really cool when you have a good one, especially like in your IDE. It'll literally just have like a red squiggly line underneath your code. Instead of like a spell checker, like you've spelled it wrong, it'll say, this is not very secure. You should maybe change this. The other type of assessment is DAST, or dynamic application security testing. Slightly different than SAST, where this runs against your code that is running. So instead of just statically looking at your Python code, you would actually start up your Django server and then point a tool at your server as it's running. And it can also identify vulnerabilities by doing a bunch of like scans and probes and looking for known bad patterns and weaknesses. The third type is SCA, or software composition analysis. This has really come on strong in the last couple of years, and of all of them, or at least of SAS, DAST, and SCA, SCA is one of the areas that I like to spend a lot of time and effort into, especially for where we're at Marquetta. This is identifying the open source components that we use and finding the vulnerabilities and the license risks. I've seen some recent studies that just constantly blow my mind of like, modern applications, like modern enterprise applications or just any web application, is upwards of like 80 to 90% open source now. And it really doesn't surprise you when you think about it. You're building your React applications. React itself is millions and millions of lines of code, and then you're just writing a little bit of code on top of that for your application. But it's like the tip of an iceberg where your code's on top, but you've got like years of open source development underneath it, and that code itself can have vulnerabilities. And that's terrifying. And that's what software composition analysis tries to do. Any Python pip package you install for Django, any NPM package you install for React could come with vulnerabilities if they're not up to date. And software composition analysis tries to find those. The next is penetration testing, which is a manual test to validate controls and identify vulnerabilities. And this is what we're going to be kind of focusing on today and what our labs are this afternoon. I want to teach you all how to manually do these because it's really cool and important skill to have. You can automate SCA, you can automate SAST and DAST. You really can't automate pen testing. This is where you need to put your attacker hat on and actually poke around. And then lastly, vulnerability scanning, I called out. It's slightly different and a little bit beyond the scope of what I'll talk about today and a little bit beyond the scope of what I do. But your applications as you write them have to run somewhere, right? So you're going to write your Django application, it's going to run on a server, or maybe you'll containerize it and run it like in a Kubernetes cluster. Well, the infrastructure itself that hosts your code can also have vulnerabilities. So it's important to not forget about that. And that's where things like vulnerability scanning come in. You can find vulnerabilities in your containers or find vulnerabilities in your virtual machines or your servers that are running the code. Any questions on this? Have any of you come across, as you're writing your Django or writing code, either in Code Platoon or elsewhere, any of these types of tools?
Ronnie, how did you end up as a junior penetration tester?
Yeah, good question. I had a funny journey, I guess. So I'd always kind of been a hacker, I guess you could say, all the way back to like high school. Like I was really into the console hacking and pirating games and like online kind of learning how to do that. But I didn't think there was really a career in that for me. So I went to college for real estate finance and was getting my degree in real estate finance and took an elective at my college on computer security because I just thought it was interesting. I thought it'd be an easy A. And my teacher told me how this career is, or this industry is starting to boom right now. It's cybersecurity. They actually can hire people to be hackers. They're called penetration testers. I was like, oh my God, this is my new dream. So I basically just ditched 4 years of what I learned in college for real estate finance and started applying and found a company in Chicago called NeoHapsis that was hiring junior pen testers. They gave me a technical screen, flew out to Chicago for an interview, and then they just hired me as a young analyst. And then I got to shadow and work with some more experienced penetration testers, learned a bunch, and just went from there.
Awesome, thank you.
When I was doing IDS work, I used a lot of vulnerability scanning, as well as a little bit of the dynamic application security testing. So whenever we found a vulnerability, whenever we found an infected system, we would do some additional triage to determine what was going on and why it was vulnerable.
Nice. What tools were you using? Can you name any?
A lot of them were homegrown.
Okay.
Between OSI and the FBI. But like as far as like vulnerability scanning, like Nmap, just looking for open ports and just general open source stuff. Eventually we were pretty much using almost all open source off of what is it, Helix was one distro that we used heavily. And
Sure. Backtrack.
What was the one with the Backtrack? That's it. I was trying to think of the one with the dragon on it.
Yeah, it's now called Kali Linux, Kali. So Backtrack became Kali, but yep, Backtrack Linux was what I was learning on also.
Yeah, and then that was basically it. We, like, for one short period of time, I got to write a trap and trace version of TCP dump. So that was kind of cool to learn how to, disassemble the headers and just spit that data out. Cool. But other than that, it was a bunch of, really 50-pound brain people that came up with some cool stuff.
Yeah. For all of these types of assessments, there's you can do all of it. You can write it yourself. There's tons of really good and mature open source tools that will do SAST, DAST, SCA, and then there's certainly no shortage of commercial tools. And those tools can range the gamut from very affordable to extremely expensive enterprise and government level contracts. But generally, for a lot of these, you're going to have some sort of tool, whether it's homegrown or commercial, to help you out with it.
So you had mentioned that it was previously a pretty siloed portion of I don't even know, software engineering. I don't even really know what to call it. And now that it's kind of your job everyone's job to make sure that you're all focusing on security. Are you seeing less and less actual jobs for junior penetration testers?
No, I don't think so. And I pause because it's like opening a can of worms. There's always this debate in our industry of will pen testers ever be out of a job because we're just getting better at automating this and we're doing it at scale. And I don't think so. Like I mentioned, pen testing has such an emphasis on manual testing, and the emphasis is on contextualizing risk. So the problem you have when you run a vulnerability scan or a dynamic application test is they're just dumb tools. They can find vulnerabilities, but they don't understand what your application does, where it exists, who uses it, what data it holds. And that's where humans or pen testers will always have the advantage and why there will always be a need for them, in my opinion. You can run a vulnerability scan, against, let's say we run a vulnerability scan against one of our applications and it finds oh, you got an out of date SSL cipher, and the vulnerability scanner marks that as a high risk. Like, oh God, we have a high risk vulnerability. But then a human can take a look at that and be like, well, this is an internal system that's never actually called. We don't even use that SSL cipher in anything. It only houses this data. That's not a high risk, it's a low risk. So humans can override what tools can say because tools don't understand that context. So I don't think there'll ever be I don't think manual pen testers or manual security engineers are going anywhere. There'll always be a demand for manual penetration testing. And even where I work now, like currently, I mean, we do as much of this as automated as possible. SAS, DAS, software composition analysis, we do vuln scanning. We still hire out for penetration testers every quarter, and they still find really good stuff and give us a lot more value. But speaking of pen testing, that actually brings me nicely to my next slide. Pen testing is a very overloaded term, and as being on like the consultant and kind of pre-sales side of this for a lot of companies, people would say, I want a pen test, but it can really mean so many different things. So actually one of my old coworkers and friends put this little guide together that we used to give customers to explain to them, like, what do you really want when you say I want a pen test? Really, a pen test just means, like, in my mind, a pen test means I want a manual person. I want a person to do this, not a tool. Now they can use a tool, but I want that person's, their insights, their opinions. But there's a lot of different things you can do. And kind of the two axes he has here are like the details that are given to the testers and the scope. So if there's full details given to a tester, and by details here, we mean like, here's all the source code, here's all the documentation, here's all the architecture diagrams. A pen tester can do basically a full review of your code and your architecture. And they're not really, in that case, emulating an attacker because an attacker doesn't have that information, but they're still going to bring you a lot of value. If you don't want to give them very many details, it's more like a full attacker simulation where a random person on the internet who doesn't have your source code or your documentation and is just kind of attacking blindly, that's still really useful too, because you can see what they can find out. That's more like a red team assessment or a black box assessment. So I really just wanted to put this in here so that you say, when I say penetration testing, it runs the gamut from like full red team, let's emulate nation state attackers and do the full latest and greatest, like, vulnerability tests and exploitation. Or it could just be, I want someone to come in and read over every line of my source code and my architecture diagrams and also find vulnerabilities. It runs the whole gamut. It's just a term that basically means someone manual to come in and have a human being put eyes on our systems.
Ronnie, and red team is like the term for like a team of good hackers?
Yeah, so red team's also a bit of an overloaded term, but yeah, the idea being, and I think it goes back to just like war game simulations, your red team are your attackers and your blue team are your defenders. So when you do a red team exercise, it really means we're going to simulate actual attackers. And a proper mature red team will actually try to simulate or emulate real attackers that we've seen in the wild. So a proper or mature red team will use the same tactics, techniques, and procedures as like the hacking groups out of Russia or China that we see actually exploiting companies. They'll use some of the exact same tools, they'll use the exact same techniques, and they'll emulate that, but they won't actually be malicious. And then as the red team is doing their thing and doing their exercise, you'll always want to have a blue team or a defender team try to identify them and get them out and block them. So it's really like a war game scenario between red team and blue team. And it's important to call that distinction too. Like, red team is oftentimes overkill for a lot of organizations. If you just want to know if you're secure or not, having a more traditional pen test is going to be more advantageous. When I'm going in for just a normal pen test, I'm not trying to cover my tracks. I'm not trying to use like the crazy exploits and tools and techniques that the nation state hackers out of Russia or China are using. I'm just going to help you find vulnerabilities. If you think you're ready for a full war game type scenario where you're ready to go toe to toe with like what attackers would be using if you were under attack from a nation state, then you can go with full red team assessment. But I'll be honest, a lot of organizations are nowhere near that. and we would actually talk companies down from requesting that, being like, I don't think you're ready for that. Let us just do a normal like handheld pen test and we'll help you find vulns. Like, you're not ready. If we went in and did a full red team, you wouldn't find us and we'd get all your data and you'd get no value from it.
And this company, they would pay for this, right? For the service. Okay. Yeah.
Or they would do it themselves. Large enough organizations will actually have their own internal red teams. So employees of the company that will just do it themselves. Cool, good questions. Okay, so I kind of already talked about this. This is really the benefit of doing manual testing, and it's because scanners don't understand that context. So that's why I wanted to teach you and kind of focus the rest of this class on manually finding and understanding these vulnerabilities, because as you are developing or testing your own code or working in an organization, like having that mindset is extremely valuable. But full disclaimer, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Just because you know how to look for vulnerabilities in web applications does not give you carte blanche to go try to find vulnerabilities in web applications. You should only ever poke around and manually test things that you have permission to test. And that's really important. And it's also easy to just do it yourself. Someone already mentioned Hack the Box. There's tons of free resources on the internet that give you explicit permission to go ahead and hack this. Or there's bug bounties, there's big companies online that publish their rules of engagement and say, you can go ahead and hit these sites at these URLs and like, that's okay. Just make sure you're actually doing it. You know, I certainly don't want to teach anyone, you know, give them these tools and then have you turn around, go to your company tomorrow and start hacking your internal stuff and getting in trouble with your security department. So just be aware, you know, with great power comes great responsibility here. Cool. All right, how's everyone doing? We're about 1 hour in, and that was the first section of just kind of like overview of security and security concepts. Do we all need like a little break, bathroom break?
Yes, please.
Okay, then it is